Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I want to get down to the nitty-gritty of why progressive storytelling, I'll put both of those things in quotes, is not actual storytelling. It is propaganda. And I'm doing this for two reasons. The first reason being that I make this claim a lot, but I don't want it to be an unsubstantiated claim. I want to have a basis of logic and reason underlying what I am claiming within a lot of my videos. So I'm going to go deep into it here today, certainly at the first. And the second reason why I want to do this is because I see a shift in the air happening right now, where you have not these entertainment companies, but the people who write the stories, the people who make the entertainment. There seems to be a little shift in their attitude, whereas they're starting to rethink what they're doing. Now, I think this is because everyone's looking forward and we can see that there are hard times in the future, and that's why they're doing this. They have not abandoned their quote-unquote progressive ideology. No, if things were still good, they would still be pressing forward. And when things get good again, they will continue with where they left off. And this is the real danger. And this is what I want to talk about today. But I want to start from the most basics of what a story is and how these quote-unquote progressive people use a story, or more accurate, misuse a story. Because pretty much every form of entertainment that you're going to pick up or look at or read has a story attached to it. Now, not all of them, but I would say most of them. You watch a television show, you watch a movie, you read a book, you read a comic, you play a video game, they all have a story attached. And it's very important, I think, to look at the basics of what these quote-unquote progressive people do with storytelling before moving on to how they misuse it and how they're going to hide their misuse of it and why we need to be on guard for this. Now, first off, before I even get into the definitions of what a story is and where I get them from, I want to go back and look at why I always talk about the same handful of thinkers and go back to them and why they define story in a correct way. I usually go back to Aristotle as my go-to, and that would be my stopping point because he defined so many things. But I would say that Aristotle himself would say that he did not invent anything. He discovered things. So Aristotle is not the inventor of logic. He's the discoverer of logic, at the very least in Western civilization. And so it would follow that when he takes logic and applies it to storytelling, which he does in his Poetics, he's not inventing anything there either. He's discovering it. And this is what he does throughout his works. And this follows with his philosophy itself and what he expresses because he's talking about looking at reality as it actually is. And so he's taking the rules of reality and applying it to things like reason, storytelling, categorization, a whole plethora of subjects. Because, as I usually say, I look at the definition of what a story is according to Western civilization. That's not to say that it's just there because it's Western civilization and I like Western civilization. I would claim it is there and it is the one I use because it is a reflection of what a story actually is in accord with the reality around us and the reality of human existence. So, again, as I always say, if we go back to Aristotle's definition of what a story is, which is 2,400 years ago, and I would say you could go even farther back, at the very least 3,000 years ago, and if you really wanted to dig really deep, you could go farther than that, but we'll stop at Aristotle because he likes to define things. Aristotle would say that a story is a representation of reality, and it is a rhetorical argument. Now, there is some overlap between those two things, because if you have a correct rhetorical argument, it is something that is based upon logic and reason itself is defined by representations of reality. That is to say, it is in accord with reality. So there is an overlap between saying a story is a reflection of reality and a rhetorical argument at the same time. Now, I'm going to seemingly contradict myself right off the bat. Seemingly. If a story is a rhetorical argument, we have to first look at what Aristotle talks about as an argument. And within his fundamental work on logic, one of them anyways, which is Posterior Analytics, at the very first page, the very first chapter, he says, all instruction, given or received by way of argument, proceeds upon pre-existent knowledge. So he's saying that if you have argumentation, it's already based upon pre-existent knowledge that you already know. Now that seemingly is not a basis of reality, but a bunch of assumptions that you just make. And this is why Aristotle has to go back into metaphysics in order to look at reality and connect that with the fundamentals that he uses for argumentation. And this is where his basis of reality itself gets put into his argumentation, which is logical and rational. Now, as long as my videos are, which is usually about half an hour to 45 minutes right now, I still do not have the time to go into metaphysics. Except to say that some people see metaphysics simply as religion, but I would say no. There's a lot of overlap between the two, but that's not what metaphysics is. That's a misnomer for metaphysics if you have that kind of mindset towards metaphysics. And that kind of mindset is probably drawn out of the fact that you have many Christian thinkers going back to Aristotle's metaphysics and just applying the principles of Aristotle's metaphysics to the Christian ideals, and therefore bringing those ideas into the Christian fold, as it were. Simply, of course, because they saw his definitions of reality matching up with their definitions of reality. Plus the fact that I know a lot of my audience probably doesn't want me talking about metaphysics. However, I also will add that even though I know I have a lot of people who listen to my channel who are atheists, I've seen atheists argue metaphysics. I've seen high-level professors at Harvard, this was probably about 20 years ago now though, who were natural law theorists. You don't have to be a theist in order to be a natural law theorist, but he was a natural law theorist and he was arguing from principles of metaphysics, even though he was an atheist. So to say that metaphysics is opposed to atheism, I would say no. However, if you want to use metaphysics as an atheist, it's a windy, twisty road. I personally don't see a whole lot of merit in it, but that's up to you. Now, I wanted to lay that down as a foundation because when we start to look at your quote-unquote progressive people who try to use argumentation in order to support their ideas, they dismiss any idea of metaphysics whatsoever. But before we get there, I have to talk about what Aristotle defines, again, as a story. He says it's a rhetorical argument. And for Aristotle, he would say, and did say, within, again, the first chapter of Posterior Analytics, that a rhetorical argument can be of two kinds. It can be inductive or it can be a syllogism. Now, by inductive, he means that you can take a particular example that you have in front of you and trace cause and effect backwards to show how a universal is present within the particular example you have in front of you. This, as I said, is a process of cause and effect following backwards through subject and predicate. What you're logically going to look at is the essence of the thing that you're talking about. Now, the question becomes, can a progressive person use this kind of rhetorical argument to build his story? Well, I would say yes and no. Yes, in the fact that they do try to make an argument that looks like it's cause and effect, that looks like it's inductive, but they do so in a sophistic way. That is to say, they're sophists. Their argument is not true nor based upon anything correct, and so they try to make an argument that looks like this, but they don't actually do so. And before getting into any specifics, let's look at what Aristotle defines as a sophist. Well, he says a sophist knows things through the accidents of that thing, not through the nature of the thing in itself, not through its essence, not through its quiddity. And what is an accident? Well, an accident is something that is a part of you or another thing, which doesn't necessarily need to be there in order for the thing to exist. That is to say, I'm a human being. My skin color will not change the fact that I'm a human being. My skin color is an accident. Now, a sophist would typically take all of those accidents and mix them together and present an argument that looks like those accidents make up the nature of the thing when they don't actually make up the nature of the thing at all. And this is what these writers try and do. And this is what we can look at with that exact example that I just gave. You have quote-unquote progressive thinkers, and they would claim that the color of your skin determines the nature of who and what you are. This is why they can claim that people who have whiteness, people who have white skin or participate in whiteness, are defined in their nature by the color of their skin, which is an accident. And we know that they do this because they will say, you can't understand as a white person any person of color and what they've gone through. There's nothing you can do to understand them because of the color of your skin. which is limiting you and your ability and your nature according to the accident of the color of your skin. Just briefly, their argument is really a communistic, socialistic argument that whiteness in itself is property, and so anyone who is born white is born with property, which means they're born with wealth. And therefore, because you can never give up your skin color, you always have this wealth and have had it from the time you were born, and therefore that makes you fundamentally different than any people of any other color skin, and therefore you cannot understand them because you have a different nature. And on top of this, I just want to point out, as I usually do, if you have these quote-unquote progressive people, they don't believe really in logic and reason to begin with. And usually when I say that, I get pushed back by somebody in the comments, and so I always flash up this Smithsonian article, which was one of a number of them that came out at the same time, defining what whiteness is, and talking about how cause and effect, which is in essence what logic is, what it does, is something that is attached to whiteness. Whiteness is just a code word for evil. So, the point of me going over all of that is simply to show the fact that, yes, these people used to try to use this kind of argument within their story as a rhetorical argument. I would say in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you would have some people who were sophists, and some of them who probably didn't even know it, tried to prove their progressive points through stories using this sophistic method. That is to say, using sophistry, using these accidents to try to show that these accidents are what define the nature of the thing that they're talking about, when that's not a logical and rational proposition at all. It is something which is simply made up through their progressive ideology. Now, within the 1990s and 2000s, certainly the early 2000s, you had more and more of these writers that were creating these stories who knew they were sophists, who knew they were promoting simply ideological backed arguments, that they weren't logical and rational. Again, I would say that continued on more and more until we got to a point which I would put about 2005, at the very least 2008, where they abandoned that attempt at storytelling altogether. And they moved on to the second form of storytelling, which, again, was there during those early times of storytelling, progressive storytelling, but really just took off like crazy about 2008. And that was a rhetorical argument based upon syllogism. Now, an argument based upon syllogism is an argument where you assume that your audience already accepts your premises. And the premises of a progressive person is that progressivism is true. And we can see this certainly within the comic industry, and I would say probably others if I looked for it, but I know the ones from the comic industry. You can see this quite specifically when you started to get, at the very least by 2008, these creators of stories saying that these stories are not for you. If you went onto social media or a message board back then and started to complain about the story, they would kick you out, but first say to you, this story is not for you, go away. Now, what do they mean by saying this story is not for you? Well, they're saying that this is a rhetorical argument based upon syllogism. That is to say, in order to actually understand the story, you need to accept the premises which we lay out to begin with, or use as our premises. And their premises is that progressivism is true. So if you're complaining about the fact that this story is no good because you don't accept the premises that it is based upon, they're saying the story is not for you because that's the whole basis of how they're writing. You must accept their premises in order for the story to make any sense. This is really summed up in the Kelly Sue DeConnick quote where she said, what was it? If you don't like my politics, don't buy my books. But this is exactly what they're saying. They're saying, yes, we understand what a story is to some extent. It is a rhetorical argument, but we're going to abandon the inductive reasoning kind of way, which we never used honestly to begin with, because they only used it sophistically, that is to say, as a sophist, and they're just simply going to concentrate on the rhetorical argument as a syllogism, where you must accept their premises for the entire thing to be true. And this kind of storytelling is a bit of a double-edged sword. Because the reason why they wanted to do this was because they believed there would be enough of an audience out there of the quote-unquote progressive type that would buy these books and make them look popular, because of course those people accepted the premises of their argument, and by making these books popular, or television shows, or movies, or games, whatever they were, by making them popular, then they would get these younger audiences in, which Marvel itself always was trying to get a younger audience and is still trying to do so. And the reason for that is because when these younger audiences came in and saw an older audience actually accepting the premises by enjoying the story and thinking it was good, which necessarily has to be done, then the young people would take that cue and say, okay, the story must be good, therefore the premises upon which the story is based must be true, therefore I accept the progressive premises of progressivism being true. And this is why I always take progressive storytelling and put it in the category of propaganda. Why? Because they're trying to teach these little children that their argument for progressivism is true when not actually giving them anything close to a logical and rational explanation for it at all. It's simply inertia. They want these older people to carry them into the idea that the basis of the argument must automatically be accepted, and thus teach them something in a way that gets around their rational mind, which is what propaganda is, or certainly the 1939 definition of what propaganda is. But here's the thing. That dynamic didn't work out as they expected. Why? Because the older, quote-unquote, progressive people simply did not buy these books en masse. If we're looking at the comic industry, I can give you numbers. I have given numbers on my channel a dozen times about 2 years ago. When we had good numbers, I would go through the numbers and show, no, these books are not selling. And why wouldn't they sell? Because they didn't take into account the fact that progressivism by nature is simply just selfishness in a different form. They're never going to actually support anything because it will always take away from me, which is the center of everything that they do. Or to shorten that all up, all they can do is virtue signal. And just briefly, just as I've mentioned in other videos, I've listened to so many Marvel podcasts at this point. They truly believed, the people at the top of Marvel Comics truly believed that there was this massive progressive audience out there that was going to support them, and they just couldn't find the way to connect correctly with them yet. They always believed that. And they believed that because that's what they wanted, because they wanted these older progressive people to buy those stories, to say they were good, and in saying that they were good, get the younger audience to simply accept the premises of their stories, which is the idea that progressivism automatically needs to be accepted as true. And I have to add, the reason why they do things like this is because they don't follow logic and reason. They abandon following any kind of logic and reason. They base everything upon emotion and personal interpretation, that kind of thing. And so if you apply logic and reason to them, this is why, by the way, the Smithsonian article denies cause and effect reasoning because they don't want it anywhere near their ideology. But if you apply logic and reason to their premises, you will see it break apart and fall to pieces pretty quickly. That's why they need to teach people their progressive ideology in a way that gets around your rational mind, which is why they're always targeting children. And one minor point here before I move on, that being that for the older progressives who are reading the story, there is an element of propaganda in there as well, inasmuch as these stories help as a support system to continue to allow them to believe that progressive ideology is true, even though reality around them tells them it is not. So, in effect, it's a coping mechanism to keep them in the mindset that progressivism is true. But the more important point here is why they use syllogism as an argument. Typically, you would use syllogism and expect your audience to accept your premises because your audience has already thought about those things and then accepts them because of some other argumentation. Possibly just argumentation that is gained through common sense. But the point being that if it is to be a true rhetorical argument that's based upon logic and reason, either your audience has already thought about those principles which you lay down and has accepted them as true through examination of what they are, or they can do so because such argumentation actually exists. But the reason why progressive storytellers stop there and use that as their basis is because they don't want their audience to examine what is behind it. And by examine, I mean actually use logic and reason to apply to the origin of the principles of progressivism to see if they are true and in accord with reality. They don't want you to do that. They want you to accept on authority that these things are true and will use whatever kind of sleight of hand they need to use in order for you, as the normal person out in society, to accept that they are true without looking at their origins. And again, this is one of the bases of why they don't want examination of things according to cause and effect, examination of things according to reason and logic, as again, that Smithsonian article tries to dissuade people to do by calling it whiteness. And again, the point being that they don't want people to do that because they know that their progressive ideology is simply made up, and it is not supported by reality. Or to put it yet another way, the entire point of their argument from authority with use of this kind of syllogism is to mask the fact that they have no metaphysical principles whereby you can trace everything back to show you that their points exist within reality objectively. The very simplest example of this is the fact that they believe people can choose who and what they are by how they feel. I'm sorry, no. If you follow logic and reason, you get defined by reality. You don't define what reality is. And if you, or your ideology, believes that you, as an individual, can with your feelings subjectively define who and what you are, not reality defining it, then that's straight up a denial of reality existing in itself, objectively. And the point why that is so important is because that then contradicts the other definition of what a story actually is supposed to be. Because, yes, you can say they make rhetorical arguments based on syllogism, and you might not accept the premises, but that doesn't deny the fact that they are rhetorical arguments, and your story is supposed to be a rhetorical argument, therefore it's actually a story. But no, you can't stop there, because they make that rhetorical argument in order to base the story on authority, which is not reality, which is something quite contrary to reality, and therefore it then denies the definition of story being a reflection of reality, which then discounts what they're doing as actual storytelling. Because remember, a story, as defined by Aristotle, needs to be both a rhetorical argument and a reflection of reality. But there are two forms of rhetorical argument, which one is sophistry and the other is an argument from authority that doesn't actually exist. Both of those things deny the ability of that story to actually be a reflection of reality, and therefore their struggle to present their story as if it was a story based upon traditional premises as a rhetorical argument contradicts in itself with their fundamental basis of the story, the other thing necessary for a story, which is a reflection of reality. So, in effect, their argument is denying that it is a story in itself. Now, I wanted to go over all of that because, number one, when I am making a rhetorical argument within a lot of my videos, I use the accepted premises that what these people are doing, these progressive so-called storytellers are doing, is not actually creating a story. They're using something else, which is akin to propaganda. That's my basis of my argumentation, and I wanted to give you, finally, if I haven't already, the logical and rational basis for why I say that, and why my argument is actually based upon reality. And number two, I wanted to talk about that because I see this shift in the air going on right now within storytelling. Certainly within comics, and I think it's about to hit other kinds of media as well. You see these people, they're looking into the future, and they see that it is not rosy. And you are going to see them not abandon their political position, their quote-unquote progressive political position within their storytelling, but I think you're going to see them recede into that old form of storytelling, that sophistic form of storytelling where they make it look like they're using inductive reasoning to support their progressive ideological talking points within their story and thus promote progressivism. And you already see this happening in certain ways. It is latching on to nostalgia, that thing which they have denied over the last couple of years, really the last decade. They've tried to demonize everyone who wants to go back to what is in the 80s and 90s because they saw that as being opposed to their progress. But now they see that their foot is slipping. Now they see that things are not going to be so rosy, and they can't sell their ideology in the way that they have been for the last couple of years and get away with it because belts are going to be worn tighter by a whole lot of people, and they're not going to put up with this nonsense. They're going to shrink back into that nostalgia, which they would see as being the old form of their progressive storytelling. But don't be fooled. It is not there in order to feed your nostalgia. It's there to act as a defensive position which these progressive storytellers retreat to in order to ensure that their political ideology lives on within these stories, even though it can't be as in your face as it has been over the last 10 years. And while that may sound like an exaggerated claim, the person that I mentioned within the video, Kelly Sue DeConnick, the last time this happened in any degree, which was the 2016 presidential election, this is the exact, and I mean the exact, thing that progressive storytellers like herself needed to do. They needed to shift gears back into a defensive position in order to ensure that progressivism was going to get through this rough patch, and when it was over, they would get back out and reclaim the territory that they had lost. I did a video on the article where Kelly Sue DeConnick claims this exact thing back in 2016, that this is what progressive storytellers need to do. And I will link that video in the description if anyone wants to go back and revisit that article where she says this. So, long story short, is me saying that if they move backwards into nostalgia, which I see them already starting to do, and they're probably going to do it much more deeply in the near future, don't be fooled by this, because it has to still be a good story. If they cannot present a good story, but can only present nostalgia, and their story is still based upon these ideas, which destroy it being a story in itself, that is the criteria that needs to be set down. If they cannot tell a good story, but rely only on nostalgia, know that this is not us winning. This is them simply taking a defensive position so that they can attack when they are able to do so in the future. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.